Well, from time to time, I have people from the congregation come up to me and they have a question or a concern about the day-to-day operations of the church. And I always thank them for sharing, but I often tell them, I'm not the one in charge here. And that really is the truth. I am not the one in charge. And that often takes people by surprise. Because most of us grew up in churches where the pastor was the person in charge. But like Greg Sherman shared with us this morning, that's not the case at Douglas UCC. We are a congregational church, which means it's not my church, it's your church. You are the ones who are in charge. And that's what today's gospel reading is all about. Notice the apostles come to Jesus with a problem that they want him to fix. They say there's not enough food, so Jesus, send the crowds away. And Jesus says, no, you feed the people. You do it. And you see what the apostles did. They broke the crowd into little groups of 50. Do you understand? They were creating little congregations. And what happened in those little congregations? They were able to feed one another. So yes, the crowds did come to hear Jesus, to hear the message, but it was the responsibility of the individual groups to feed one another, to sustain one another, and to support one another. And that's what it means to be a congregational church. Now, I recently heard through the grapevine that a member of this church said that when I'm on sabbatical next year, she's not going to come to church for those entire 3 months. I heard her say to another member of the congregation, I'm just going to wait until Sal comes back. And I guess in a way I should feel flattered about that. But actually it makes me very disheartened. Because to be a member of a congregational church carries with it a responsibility. And the responsibility means that you support and sustain the church at all times, good or bad. For 137 years, the congregation of this little church has done that. They did that especially during the times in our church's history when this church didn't have a pastor. There were many times in the church's history where we went through periods where there was not a pastor here. And the congregation continued to feed one another and support one another and sustain one another. That's what a congregational church is all about. Now, back in 2007, the members of this congregation published a book. It was the 125th anniversary of this church, and they put out a book that is called Voices of the Congregation. Not voices of the pastors, voices of the congregation. This book tells stories of people, men and women throughout this church's history who were there during the Depression, during the World Wars, during good times and bad, during thick and thin. They kept the church going. And all of us are part of that legacy. Now, one of the people that is mentioned in this book is a woman named Isabel Graham, who died in 1954. Isabel did what today's gospel message is all about. She gave of her blessings and she shared it with this community. And today, more than 6 decades after she died, Isabel Graham continues to feed us. Isabel gifted us with $5,000. And like the 5 loaves in today's gospel, it multiplied and increased to more than $1 million. Now, in this book, it says, quote, "Not much is known about the life of Isabel Graham, end quote. And that was true at the time this book was written. But recently, one of the members of our church, Elizabeth Estes, she has been researching into the life of Isabel Graham. And she has uncovered this incredible, unbelievable story of courage and inspiration. So right now, I'd like to call Elizabeth to come up and to tell us Isabel Graham's amazing story.
Thanks, Sal. I had a project I'm working on where I've been researching strong women from Michigan, and it started looking at Ella Kellogg and Cora Anderson and Rosa Parks. And then, after a smart suggestion, I dove in to learn more about Isabel Graham. You know, the former journalist and radio producer in me kicked in, and I became dogged to learn as much as I could. And it also took a proverbial village to find out what we've uncovered so far. So thanks to Sal, Garnett Lewis, Monica from Saugatuck City Hall, Greg Smith, and Dan McGavin for all the contributed pieces of what I'm about to tell you. Isabel Graham is a name that many of us know, but maybe not all of us, and we've heard it at one time or another as it relates to the Duck Fund here at the church. And today's sermon, as Sal said, of multiplying the loaves is a perfect one, because although she may not have set out to do it, she did just that. As Sal mentioned, and we don't share he didn't know what I was going to say, and I didn't know what he was going to say, so there might be some repeats here, but in the 125th anniversary of the book, it said, little is known about Miss Graham. She was the daughter of Hugh Graham, the man who is known as the builder of the church. Reportedly, she was a successful businesswoman in the Chicago area who never married and who left the bulk of her estate to a niece, a nephew, and a woman friend. Yeah, all of us know what that stood for. Regardless, in 1954, upon her death, Isabel Graham left $5,000 to the church. Today, that would be the equivalent of one of us leaving $50,000. The bequest had a couple of strings attached. The church would receive the interest each year, but not the principal until certain of her heirs had passed away. In the meantime, Northern Trust Bank of Chicago was to have invested in a small portfolio of blue chip stocks. It would be reinvested, and we couldn't touch the money until 1998 or after. Again, that proved to be an astute business decision, because when it reached its maturity, it had about $750,000, now over $1 million. And keeping with her philosophy, the church has since only given away the interest on that money, roughly $30,000 every year to local charities. But who was Isabel Graham? I should let you now know that I have a subscription to every Ancestry, Social Security, and historical site that's functional. My monthly subscription bills have skyrocketed, so if you want to know anything about your great Aunt Tilly, I'm your girl. But you should also know that when you do something like this, there's lots of checking and double checking that's necessary. Dates are often wrong, spellings are wrong by census takers, and names are commonplace, become jumbled with other names. There's a lot of coincidences that had to be sorted out. And as I learned from my own grandmother, women of this era also changed their birth years to appear younger than they were. So, suffice it to say, researching Isabel was like unraveling a knotted ball of string. However, to the best of my knowledge, and with a lot of references to back it up, as Paul Harvey would say, let me tell you the rest of the story. Isabel was born June 29, 1871, to Hugh Graham and Josephine Sill Graham. According to early census notes, as a child, she went by the nickname Belle. Later in life, that reference was dropped, and she was most definitely Isabel G. Graham, Isabel. She was the fourth of 5 kids. She had 3 brothers and 1 sister. She was born here in Douglas, raised here in Douglas, went to Sunday school in this church, and as a total surprise to me, her remains are buried in the Douglas Cemetery, next to her parents and her older sister, Bertha, who died in 1880 at the age of 16 when Isabel was 9 years old. Bertha, like many Americans of the time, died of consumption or tuberculosis. I have to imagine how that affected Isabel at 9, old enough to know what was happening with her big sister. And it dawned on me that although Hugh Graham, Isabel's dad, originally suggested building a non-denominational church in Douglas in 1871, it was completed 2 years after Bertha died in 1882, perhaps when the Graham family needed it the most. When I realized Isabel was buried in the Douglas Cemetery, I drove immediately there in a downpour, weaved my way around until I found her grave, the unkept grave of Isabel Graham, her sister, father, and her mother. I got out of the car and realized that this whole time, this woman who had given so much to our church and to this community was buried there with no one looking after the plot. With some volunteer help, I have a plan to remedy that, but that's for another day. To know Isabel is to know her family, and the family history in this church is part of the story. First, it's not an exaggeration to say that we would not be sitting here today without Isabel's dad, Hugh, who was both a master carpenter, was the son of a lumberman, and a farmer. He did build this church, crooked steeple and all, and he actually built this pulpit. Yeah, it gives me chills a little bit. He was a soldier in the Union Army in the Civil War in Delphi, Indiana for 1 week. I don't know how that happened, but back then when you were drafted, you could find somebody to take your place. I'm not sure if that's what happened, but it was a short tenure. However, Delphi is where Hugh and Josephine were married. According to the Douglas Village Farm Census in 1870, the Grahams had 20 farmable acres and 7 acres of woodland here in Douglas on a combination of land at Union and Wiley, and their home plot where Isabel grew up. A home still standing on Union Street in Douglas known as Bonnie Meadows. In 1870, it was recorded that the family farmed corn, oats, buckwheat, and produce, most likely apples. When Isabel was 20, in mid-1891, tragedy struck again when her brother Ernest died in Beaumont, Texas at 27 years old. He's buried there, and he had no heirs. After 1890, Isabel went to college, but we're still investigating and confirming where. Our speculation is it's the University of Chicago. In 1904, her dad passed away, and at least by 1910, or probably before, Isabel was in Chicago. Although obviously smart with money, she was not a rough-and-tumble businesswoman, as many of us have always thought. Isabel, according to multiple censuses, was a public school teacher. We also know for part of her life, as it was confirmed on her death certificate, she was an elementary school principal. On several census forms, Isabel noted that she had 4 years of college, which was interesting at the time because in order to teach back then, you didn't need a 4-year degree. Maybe she always knew she wanted to be a principal. Maybe she was intellectually curious. I'm not sure. Isabel lived in various places on the near south side of Chicago, and she always rented. I even triangulated where she lived over multiple decades on a map, and for a hot second thought perhaps she could have taught at Hyde Park Academy in 1915, when their most famous student, Amelia Earhart, graduated. Much to my dismay, I haven't been able to prove that theory, although they were definitely in the same neighborhood at the same time. I do know, based on public records, that for some time, Isabel was the principal at Fisk Elementary in Chicago, now one of the shuttered public schools on the south side. According to the 1910 census, when she was teaching, Isabel lived in a boarding house in Chicago with 3 women who were also public school teachers. One of them was Nona L. Butterfield, a first-grade teacher who had moved to Chicago from Duluth, Minnesota, after growing up in the UP of Michigan. In 1920, Isabel and Nona lived in Chicago together with Isabel's mom, Josephine, who had moved from here in Douglas because she was losing her sight and in failing health. Josephine Graham died in Chicago in 1922, 18 years after her husband. In her obituary, it stated, "Soon after her arrival in Douglas, she became interested in the development of a struggling Sunday school, the beginning of a lifetime of service and Sunday school work. An ardent student of the Bible, Josephine committed many passages to memory, thus becoming a comfort and solace in her declining years. Being a charter member of the First Congregational Church of Douglas, she became identified with all of its activities, a faithful member and Christian worker as long as strength permitted." On your way out today, if you'll turn around and look at that stained glass above the doors, it says First Congregational Church, and underneath it reads, "The Sunday School." According to our records, it was put there by or for Isabel's mom, Josephine Graham, and her Sunday school. It was paid for by the very first church service at this church. In 1882, there were 338 people in attendance, yes, at 2 services. The entire remaining debt for the building of this church, $352, was collected that day. As much as Isabel adored her father, which is well documented, she appears to have gotten her mother's Josephine's spirit. Josephine's obit went on to say, "Mrs. Graham was a careful reader, a student of public affairs, an independent thinker, and one who could be depended on to champion the course which would serve the best interests of the community. It sounds like Isabel. From all I've learned, it appeared that Isabel led an ordinary life, but perhaps for her times in an extraordinary way. And she, like her mom, was an independent thinker, and one story highlights that. In the 1930 census, Isabel Graham was living with Nona Butterfield on the south side of Chicago. And at the time, Nona was listed as the head of the household. So they always listed one person as the head of the household and everybody else who lived there, how they were related. When asked her relationship to the head of the household, Isabel listed it as partner in 1930. Pretty remarkable for the day. In 1940, however, Isabel was listed as the head of the household, and Nona said her relationship to her was sister. Much of Isabel's family had passed away or were living somewhere else. She had nothing to hide. But Nona grew up in a relatively well-known family on Drummond Island in Detour, Michigan. I found newspaper articles about her cotillion when she was young. That's where they actually invite bachelors to come meet the single girls, only Nona's was on April 1st. So I don't know if that was... You all put that together. But Nona obviously wasn't as comfortable with the nature of their relationship. Kinds of sounds like one person was out and one person wasn't. And no one in the gay community has ever heard that before. For those not gay in the room, it's not exactly an anomaly. Isabel and Nona visited Douglas often, and Isabel was listed as a member of this church in the 1940s. Together, Isabel and Nona were listed as the sellers of the Bonnie Meadows home, and several of the algorithms on the Ancestry sites list Nona Butterfield as Isabel's spouse. You can imagine my surprise when I uncovered all of this. Isabel Graham died on May 7th, 1954. She was almost 83 years old. On a macro level, she lived through some of our nation's most historical significant periods: the Second Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, Prohibition, women's suffrage, and 2 world wars. On a more personal level, she and Nona lived together for over 44 years. Nona was the person who managed her death in Cook County and had her cremated and buried here in Douglas. Being cremated at the time was pretty unusual, and the romantic in me wants to believe that Isabel wanted Nona to keep part of her ashes. But truth be told, that's the historical fiction book I'm writing in my head. I can't prove it. In addition to the church bequest, Isabel left money to Nona, a niece, Mabel, and her spouse, and our church. But it's believed that half of her estate in 1954 went to Planned Parenthood. Progressive thinker is an understatement. Now, I'm certain that Hugh Graham had no idea when he built this pulpit in 1882 that 137 years later, some woman would be standing at it talking, probably too long, by the way, talking about his daughter, Belle. But all of this research over the past few weeks has me connected to the spirit of Isabel Graham. She didn't just leave us an inheritance, she left us a great example. She obviously lived her truth at a time when that wasn't easy to do. I marvel at that. Sometimes it's hard enough to do now in today's world. Isabel gave back in a way that was smart and meaningful. Like Jesus in today's sermon, she had a compassion for human beings and their needs. The parable of the fish and the loaves isn't just a story about abundance, it's a story about sharing. The miracle happened when people shared what they had. Jesus knew it was the hungry that needed the food, not the well-fed. Isabel did the same thing with her gift. She shared what she had, did what she could to multiply it, and trusted us to shepherd it. She left a legacy of sharing that's still giving 65 years later. And with our steadfast care, it'll be giving for a long, long time. This whole experiment has made me look at myself in the mirror and ask what I want my legacy to be. What more can I do for my family, for this town, and for this church? I think the Isabel story in today's reading is a reminder to each of us to share our time, talents, and treasures with the world. There's an old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Isabel's timing was perfect. This student was ready, and amazingly, Isabel is still teaching. What a gift. Isabel Graham represents all that's good about our community. Her family sowed the ground and harvested the produce, and the crops we're blessed to have. Her father built part of the town and this church, and her mom taught the youth, started a Sunday school, and taught her children to be engaged in civic activities. Like many of us as a family, they lived through good and bad here. But there is no doubt their daughter Isabel loved this town and this church because ultimately she came home. Through her profession as a teacher, Isabel surely gave many lessons. And after death, she planted a seed here a seed that's now bearing fruit for so many people who need the help. She did it quietly and without fanfare. She did it out of respect for her parents, and I believe in the hope that something good would come from it. She lived her life fully and unapologetically. She didn't ask that anyone ever know her name or know that much about her, but I'm so glad we do. Thank you.